Hello, and welcome to our first LinkedIn Live show where we are discussing diversity of thought with diversity, equity, and inclusion expert Baljit Kaur. Baljit has trained my business on diversity and she's provided training and consultancy for our clients too, so I can highly recommend her from a personal experience. Hello, Baljit.
Thank you for hosting me, Lee. Nice to be here.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And I'm also joined by Kirsty Ames, who's emceeing the show. Hi, Kirsty.
Hi, Lee. Hi, Baljit. How everybody? It's good to be here today.
So, Baljit, I speak to a lot of organisations. Many of them have invested heavily in diversity, but the one area that they are less sure of is diversity of thought. So, a company might have a 50-50 gender split on their leadership team, but if they all went to Oxford and Cambridge, you're not going to get a lot of diversity, are you? So is this the unspoken element of diversity, Baljit?
So I agree with you, Lee, in that we can have teams that look very different, but they have very similar backgrounds, very similar personalities, belief systems, and educational experience, just the way that you've described there, Lee. So what that means, a combination of all of those things means that they are thinking in a very similar way. So we are at risk of groupthink in our organizations. So the diversity narrative has been broadened to diversity of thought. So we hear a lot of organizations speak about diversity of thought. And that's great. It's a really important aspect. When we refer to diversity of thought, we are saying we want people that bring different approaches, different perspectives to our organization. They're able to push boundaries. They're able to challenge the status quo. They're able to ideate solutions, creative solutions even, to problems and challenges and opportunities that an organization has. So on that note, it's really important to have diversity of thought. We want people to think differently and operate differently within our organizations so that we're continuing to innovate and we are sustainable in the long term. So nothing wrong with diversity of thought, absolutely important for organizations to have. But I just want to, Lee, make a very important point here, in that the argument with the diversity of thought thinking is that people do not need to look different. People do not need to identify with an underrepresented or a minoritized group in order to bring diverse viewpoints to an organization. That's absolutely correct. There is nothing incorrect about that. But what I am saying is that whilst it's not incorrect, it is actually incomplete. It's incomplete in that the way that I've described the narrative around diversity of thought is almost detaching it, decoupling it from diverse representation. So if we just think in that, only in the terms that I've described, diversity of thought is about different approaches, perspectives, regardless of the representation issue, then what we have done is we've detached from diverse representation, which is an important aspect of diversity. When we talk about diverse representation, we are talking about people of different ethnicities, gender, sexual orientation, abilities, and other aspects of identity. When we refer to the D in DE&I, so when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion, the way that you introduced it, Lee, that D is talking about diverse representation. That D is talking about those social demographic groups whose identities are attached to systems of marginalization, systems of oppression, systems of disadvantage. So it's important to think about diversity in its broadest sense, which is diversity of thought and diverse representation. The two go hand in hand. They are complementary. They are not contradictory.
Really well explained, Baljit. So I think the key point there is that true diversity is diversity of thought and diverse representation. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. So what is culture add and should it replace culture fit?
Okay, so culture fit has sort of is tending to go a little bit out of favor because it's taken on a tribal meaning. And the tribal meaning is very much that when we look to recruit, there is a danger that we recruit people that we like. We recruit people that are like us. we recruit people that we are likely to get on with. So you'll have heard of that beer test or the lunch test. Is this somebody I could go to lunch with, or is this
affinity
somebody?
bias.
That's it. That's absolutely it, Lee. Affinity bias. Is this somebody that I could get on with? So that affinity bias, and bias in its broader sense, there's a huge number of biases, all of which manifest within our workplaces. So those kinds of biases are highly subjective. However, the brain does like familiarity. The brain is wired to like relatability and predictability. So we are all wired to this bias that you just referred to there, this affinity bias, to like this likability bias. So culture fit has gone out of favor for those reasons. However, when I'm working with organizations, I always say to them, the question I ask them is it okay to recruit for culture fit? And because of what I've just outlined, the majority of people will say, no, it's not okay to recruit for culture fit. But it is okay to recruit for culture fit, as long as you are defining very clearly what you mean by culture fit and how you are identifying, evaluating, and assessing for culture fit. Because absolutely organizations do need to recruit for culture fit, but the way that culture fit should be defined in that sense is, are the individuals that we are recruiting aligned to our corporate organizational values? Because those are the values that are those shared values that connect people together in our organization. Those values describe the context within which we want individuals to perform against. So those values are really important. And the other element of culture fit is, do the individuals that we're recruiting, do they have the right motivation? Is there that natural sort of desire to work for our organization, the nature of work, the service that we provide? Is that intrinsic interest and motivation there? So if you define culture fit in that way, then it's absolutely right for people, for organizations to recruit for culture fit. So that's culture fit. Culture add is not there to replace culture fit, because often I see that sort of we saying get rid of culture fit and it's all about culture add. No, we absolutely need culture fit in the way that I've described, but culture add is an extension of culture fit. And what culture add is saying is, before we go out to recruit, it's good to review what are those approaches and perspectives and skills and insights that we have within the organization that are going to help us achieve our business goals, and what is it that we don't have. So culture add is saying we are not going to recruit people that are very similar to what we have. We're going to look for difference. That in itself lends you to then recruit for diversity. And when we think about culture add, it is very much thinking about, what is our culture as it stands today? How would we describe our culture as it stands today? In terms of our values, which are those expectations that we have, what are those and how far are we from achieving those? Because values, as I say, are the expectations we have of people, but culture is very much about how things are actually being done at this moment in time. And there is a potential mismatch in organizations between the two. So what is that culture gap? And then understanding what we need to recruit for, what are those attributes and personalities and backgrounds and identities we need to recruit for, which are going to help us bridge that culture gap. And also thinking about, perspectives and approaches that are missing. Have we got people that are very creative on this team? Not many people that are analytical, in which case the next job description we're going to put together, we're going to actually change some of the criteria that we're asking for.
Brilliant, thank you. And I've seen hiring managers hire people they like, affinity bias, then not interview them correctly because they've got something in common like rugby, football, and then it's not worked out. So, it shows the dangers of affinity bias. So I remember when you trained me, Baljit, I think you described culture as your northern star, your northern star is your values, and culture add is what you are lacking from a diversity of thought perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And when you're thinking about that culture gap, it's also thinking about those identities that we just mentioned in terms of, are there parts of the community or our customer base which aren't resembled internally or not adequately represented at the various levels and departments within the organization. So taking that into account when we're thinking about culture add as well.
Fantastic. I just wanted to just leap in quickly. If you do have any questions for Baljit as we go through, we are about to go into some more practical tips about how you can kind of look to include diversity of thought in your business. But if you do have any questions, just pop them in the comments and I'll bring them up. And now, Baljit, I do want to ask, diversity of thought, that's obviously powerful, but how am I supposed to have that as well as the best person to fill the role in my company for the job itself? How am I supposed to kind of balance the two of those?
Okay, so the best person for the job, we should always be hiring the best person for the job. The way that we define the best person for the job is the person of greatest merit. So that is somebody who has scored the maximum in terms of measuring against the criteria that you have got in place for that particular role. So that's how we would assess for merit. Is this the person of greatest merit? If you do anything else and you take into account anything else other than the person of greatest merit, then we are in territory which has some legal consequences attached to it. So if, for example, we were recruiting people on the basis of an aspect of their identity, the color of their skin or their sexual orientation, whatever that aspect might be, then that's actually unlawful in the United Kingdom. So we have to hire people of the greatest merit. So there should
not
be
happening there, is it, Baljit? I know big corporates that aren't hiring the best person on merit because of diversity representation.
Yeah, and if they're doing that, then there is a very live risk there. But the thing that should be looked at there is if we haven't got the people that are coming through that are of the greatest merit, because there are some bottlenecks in our processes or the talent pipeline, there is those individuals don't appear in our talent pipeline, then rather than affecting things at that sort of final point, we should be looking at all of those processes. And that's the bit, where we need to be thinking about what is it we can do to actually, what Lee, when we were speaking on that training session, the way that I put this across, and this is something that people in the audience will be familiar with. It is all about how do we widen the gate as opposed to lower the bar. So how do we widen the gate so we're getting the most diverse pool of talent come through? So that when we, if they're there at the outset, then they're likely to appear at the end of the process. So we're in more, we'll be in a position where we can actually hire people of the greatest merit. So this is then thinking about that entire process and almost forensically analyzing that entire recruitment selection process, from sourcing to attraction to recruitment to selection, and understanding how we build in inclusivity, how we ensure that the entire process is debiased, how we make sure it is accessible to people from all underrepresented, disadvantaged, marginalized groups, and how do we ensure that it is equitable. And there are lots and lots and lots of things that you can do there. And I'm sure there's a lot of good practice happening in organizations that are here on this call. But if I had to pull out maybe a handful and say, what are those three areas? And I'm not going to sort of talk about some of the things that people may be familiar with, like, gendered language, those kinds of things, because I'm just thinking there's more likely to be greater familiarity in those areas. But what I will pick out is three areas that hopefully will add value to our audience today. And one is around our brand. So when we talk about our branding, and that's in all of our documentation, that could be our website, that could be our job descriptions, any recruitment, recruiting material, whatever that might be. So the first point is around our brand. How are we ensuring that we are authentic in what we do? And when we refer to authenticity, I see lots of organizations, which is absolutely fantastic, lots of organizations posting lots of information around their diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion strategies, the work that they're doing in this area, how they're bringing their values to life. There's some role modeling going on there. It's absolutely great. It's fantastic. But what I am seeing is often it's not embedded in all of this recruitment material and documentation. It's almost like when I look at websites, there's a section in About Us where there's a subsection around diversity and inclusion, and that's where it's kind of shoehorned. So what I'm asking organizations is just to sort of think about it a little bit differently and think about it in terms of storytelling. Because remember, we've got a very heightened awareness. We've got a very socially minded consumer base out there who can see through and see, hang on, every website is looking very similar now. There are sections on diversity and inclusion, and it just seems like people have jumped onto the bandwagon. How can we
feel like International Women's Day with a lot of virtue signaling, and then with the gender pay gap?
Absolutely. Yes. So who's performative in this area and who's not? So authenticity for me is when we actually look to do some storytelling. So, and there's an art to doing that storytelling and embedding it throughout your website and all your recruiting material and everything that you do around recruitment and selection, rather than shoehorning it in. Patagonia are a very good example. They're obviously, very progressive organization in this space, but they almost have that one memorable idea. They call it unusual. What do they call it? Business unusual is what they call it. So that's their theme, if you like, a memorable idea. And then what they do is they actually transform that into a story and talk about how they originated and how they bring their values to life. But it's bedded into the work that they do and the messaging that they're portraying to their communities. So just thinking about that mindset shift in terms of how do we do storytelling when it comes to our brands. And when we talk about authenticity isn't just saying these are all the good things that we do. Hey, these are our values and this is all the good stuff that we do. It's also thinking about, yes, your areas for improvement and being very transparent in those areas. And some organizations, very few, but some organizations are actually posting complaints and customer feedback, negative customer feedback or staff feedback on their websites and saying, this is what we've done about it. This is what we've learned through the process. Because authenticity is at the heart of trustworthiness. How do we ensure that we're building that trust and confidence amongst our communities? That's just the first point.
No one's perfect, are they?
Yeah, I was going to say we've got a lot to cover. So Baljit, I know we could listen to you speak about it all day. I think now let's move on to that second point that you spoke about.
Okay, so the second point would be around how do we bake diversity into our recruitment material. Again, recruitment material, job descriptions, adverts, everything that you have in place. So any messages you're sending out in this area. So baking diversity, I've seen a lot around, as I say, gendered language and all those kinds of things, but this I'm not seeing so much of, which I'd like to see more of. So when we're looking to put some criteria together against which we are benchmarking people against, that criteria almost needs to lend itself to diversity. So for example, I'm going to take my example of doing work in this diversity, equity, inclusion consultancy space. So if you are looking for a consultant in this space, if your criteria were to say, we want somebody who has got lived experience of bias, of being stereotyped, of experiencing discrimination, so that when they come to our organization, they're able to deliver in that authentic way, as opposed to that tokenistic way. That's you baking in diversity into your recruitment criteria. Yeah, you're asking for somebody who has got that unique experience. Another one could be, if you're working for, I don't know, the national heritage sites, you're a leader in that organization. When you're looking to put that leadership criteria together based on your data and your evidence, which we know is common fact, that there is an underrepresentation of the South Asian community in terms of accessing these heritage sites and natural sort of history sites, etc. So you can have a bespoke criteria in your job description when you're going out for your next leader or whoever it is, to actually bring that expertise and insight to your organization. So that's an example of...
I think it's such a good point, Baljit. I've had far too many female candidates and from other groups not take a recruitment process forward because of the recruitment material and on the website, seeing a complete lack of diversity and the words being used. So I think it's a really good point. And your final third tip?
Final third tip would be around. I'm gonna go for this one. There's lots, as I say, but I'm gonna go for this one. So this is going to be around how do you identify that potential. We know that lots of underrepresented, marginalized individuals that belong to those demographic groups, they have not had the social capital to maximize opportunities over their lifetime. So they don't necessarily have those skills and attributes demonstrated in that conventional way that you're looking for them to demonstrate. So how do we actually identify individuals for their potential? Yeah, so this is about the difference between ability and capability. Ability is something that I have proven, I can prove to you. It's proven in my experience. But capability, well, I can't say I've got experience in this, but I'm absolutely capable of doing this. And I think this is a knack. So when we look through our applications and our CVs, how do we nurture that knack of carefully identifying that potential, those transferable skills, those supplementary attributes, those adjacent sectors that people bring experience to. So that could be through interests that people actually talk about, or it could be through voluntary work that they've got, or it could be through study qualifications, or it could be through, as I say, other sectors, or it could be people that have been laid off, or it could be people that belong, ex-military and, veterans, and a number, the list goes on. So how do we identify that? I would rather hire somebody in my company that has less experience, but brings that learner mindset to me, rather than somebody who's got lots of experience, but really that just means that they're more fixed in their approach and their learning agility is very little. So how do we do that? And just, one quick point on that. And the reason why I make that point as my third point is because it's recognizing that talents and abilities are malleable. Yeah, we can mold people, to whatever we need in our organization. And secondly, when we talk about these qualities for those different demographic groups, they manifest in very different ways, not in those conventional ways that we look for.
3 fantastic tips there. So that brand authenticity, storytelling, baking diversity into everything, hire for potential, hire for capability. Good. So some of our viewers might be worried about team dynamic when you introduce diversity of thoughts to a team. How do you do it in a way that means you still have a cohesive team rather than having lots of people completely disagreeing and not getting anything done?
Okay. So you've landed on, Lee, the most important, the most vital part of diversity of thought. What I say to organizations that I work with is this one point. We spend a lot of time in this diversity area. How can we seek more diversity, greater diversity for our organizations? Which is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But then when people arrive, there's almost this low tolerance for people to come in and challenge the status quo, deviate from those norms, the way things are done around here. So what we need to do is to ensure that, as well as seeking that diversity, we know how to leverage that diversity of thought and diverse representation. The leveraging bit is something that I do not see done well in many organizations. There is good practice, but not in many organizations. We stop at the diversity piece, but what was the point of going through all of that effort to bring all of this diversity in? Because there is time and money and effort involved in this. So the leveraging piece is the bit that you are referring to there. How do we leverage that diversity so that we do build those cohesive teams? A couple of things there. One is around, and this is a concept that most people will be familiar with, is around how do we build that psychological safety in our organizations? Yeah, psychological safety. Words that almost lose meaning because we say them so often in that repetitive way. We kind of, it also sort of almost undermines the significance of psychological safety in our organizations. So this is about people being able to bring them their, again, terminology people will have heard, bring their whole self to work and be able to voice up their opinions and perspectives, the very things that we sought out in the first place. So this is being able to do so without any fear of any kind of recrimination. So building those safe spaces. Now, when we had Black Lives Matters, organizations went into overdrive and started to have these safe spaces, and the intent was good. The intent was very good. And some of the conversations were a little bit clumsy, but it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It was a starting point. And for many organizations, it's the first time they brought people together. But now we need to move those safe spaces into an area whereby we've got more conversational integrity happening in our organizations. And what I mean by that is that it's almost sort of taking those conversations and being a bit more intellectual about them. The conversational integrity is ensuring that everybody that's involved in those conversations feels psychologically safe to do so. That's about people knowing what empathy means and how to demonstrate empathy, how to take perspectives from other people, how to actually do some reflective listening and learning in that space, having that self-awareness around themselves. All of those factors are built into this terminology that we're using around conversational integrity. It's about our leaders and our managers or whoever is facilitating those conversations to be able to skillfully do so. Because when it comes to hybrid working and when it comes to climate change conversations, we're quite comfortable in that space. Generally speaking, we're comfortable in having those conversations. But when it comes to areas around race or sexual orientation or disability or gender, we become less comfortable. So I would like to see, on the back of Black Lives Matters, organizations that had those, how are we continuing those? So we have some longevity in this area. We had first gay footballer, Jake Daniels. Did we hold some spaces at that time? When we were talking about, sexual orientation, when we think about Child Q and the experience, those of you that are familiar with Child Q in our school educational system and that racial profiling and labeling, how did we bring that back into the workplace to create a safe space for people to talk about those areas? Even think, areas like Sarah Everard and Samina Nessa. How did we ensure that we're having those conversations? These are all opportunities for us to create those psychologically safe spaces. And then the third point, very quickly.
Just before you move on to the third point, we've had a comment here for Pete, which is he always understood psychological safety is the ability to screw up and feel that if you put your hand up, then people will help you, not shout at you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the way that's put across. Yeah, no fear of being, humiliated or any other adverse repercussion. This is a learning space. When we talk about learning and development for organization, it absolutely is that formal learning, bringing in a consultant to do some learning so that you've got that consistency of awareness. But then the programmatic approach to learning and development, which is what organizations need to be in the space of, is thinking about how do we continue those conversations in those safe spaces? Because a one-off learning session isn't going to do the job. It's a start. It's a very good start.
And then very quickly, your final point. We do have to round up soon. Very, very quickly, your final point.
Okay, my final point is around setting the expectation in the organization, setting the expectation around getting that feedback and challenge. Yeah, because if we've got that diversity of thought and we want to leverage it, we need to give our people permission. We need to set that expectation. So what are those initiatives we have throughout the organization, like in our team meetings? Do we have a devil's advocate? Are we asking some powerful questions as to why people may disagree? Or, are there other things like hackathons or group you've got departments working together and really provocative thinking going on? So how are we creating that expectation and equipping our people to provide good feedback and challenge? That is a skill set, not something we can assume everybody does in the correct way.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Baljit. In a second, Baljit, we're going to come to you and ask for a top tip which people can sort of go with and use to implement. But Lee, do you want to give us just a roundup about what we've spoken about today?
So many pearls of wisdom, Baljit. I think the key points that have come out for me, obviously, still the best person for the job, greatest merits. True diversity is diversity of thought and diverse representation. Bake diversity into everything. Analyze your A to Z so that you can widen the gate to allow the most people through. And think hire for capability, not just proven people.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lee. So in a second, Lee, we're just going to tell people about what they can expect from the other episodes of the show. So I'm going to come back to you. But Baljit, first, that top tip that you think anybody who's watching this who thinks, diversity of thought is something they want to get involved in, what would you recommend that they do?
So the first and foremost, the one quick, easy thing we can do, powerful impact, is to have clarity of intent. How do we clarify our intent? Are we talking about diversity of thought in those very broad sense and not thinking about diversity of representation? So what is our intent in this space? When we talk about culture fit, is culture fit in, is culture fit out? What do we mean by it? So what is your clarity of intent? How are you defining these concepts? That would actually be the driver as to what you do and your success in this area.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Right, we're coming to the end of the show now, Lee. It's our first show. It's been fantastic. I think Baljit's added a lot of value. What kind of things can people expect from the show moving forward?
So, I mean, obviously the diversity area is so large that we're going to be doing a diversity topic once a quarter, assuming Baljit is happy to do so. And will be a monthly show, and that will be on areas of energy and clean tech that are pertinent to the current industry.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, Lee, do you want to take us out? So say goodbye to everybody.
Yeah, so thank you, viewers, for attending. I'd like to thank Kirsty for setting up my very first LinkedIn show. And thank you, Baljit, for a really informative session.
Thank you. Happy for people.